Tonight, I'm going to share with you the 10 lessons we've learned in the past 10 years of running a national customer satisfaction index. And we can share these lessons because we are sitting on a wealth of information that we feel privileged to have. We're privileged because we are able to measure brands using what's called the uniform questionnaire, which means the same questionnaire across all the industries, so that brands can compare themselves not only to their peers, but to other industries and also to other markets. So the feedback that I'll be sharing with you is digging into these thousands and thousands of records to find some lessons that we can use and we can share with companies about service excellence. When we started, we had an expectation that the market would embrace what we were doing. We thought that companies would be very excited that there was finally a benchmark that they can compare themselves to. The reality was the opposite, and that was our paradigm. And the paradigm at the time was that companies were used to receiving awards, because we essentially also do give out awards, and they were only interested if the awards were in their favor. And only a handful of companies understood the importance of having a benchmark which was credible and independent and neutral. So we decided that we had to reshift our orientation and understand the driver behind our index is consumers. If we can collect enough consumer assessments, then brands would be forced to listen. So we shifted our orientation and we started focusing on consumers. In our first year, we collected around 10,000 assessments. Last year, we closed the year with 40,000 assessments. That's an increase of around 300% in the 10 years. And more importantly, it's 300,000 assessments that people had taken the time to come and rate the brands that they deal with. What we learned from doing this is the following, and this is our second lesson of the evening, that people really do want to be empowered. People want to be in a position where they can give feedback and feel that somebody's listening to that feedback. It's not just one way, it's two-way. So the way that we empowered people was a shift as well. We had to be agile, so we shifted our orientation. In 2010, people were allowed to rate brands only for the last quarter of the year. We opened that up, so it's 24/7. Also in 2010, people were only able to rate brands on a desktop. Now they can rate brands on multiple platforms, and we also conduct phone calls to boost the sample in categories where we feel where we need to. Results in the beginning were opaque. In other words, we never even published results. We didn't want to announce that this brand had a low rating and the other brand had a high rating. We were afraid of doing that. But the reason we opened it up, and we did that in 2016, was because we realized that consumers feel that, okay, we're complaining about service, but we're not getting anywhere with it. So we said, okay, let's open it up so brands would be forced to listen to the feedback. And the last thing that we did is we enabled an impact which wasn't there in the beginning. And the way we did that is we publicly display not only star ratings, scoreboard rank of brands, but people can also share the reviews and agree and disagree. So there's a conversation happening between us, the company, and the consumer. And that really made a difference in terms of beginning to shift the mindset. We're not totally there, but the journey has started. So I'm going to now shift to the data and the insight that I can give you based on the data. As you've heard so far, we've collected a very large sample of data. So the way we interpret it is using what we call our legend of heroic to unheroic. So heroic is any brand that for a full year has scored 90 points out of 100. And this is a brand that's giving what we consider incredible service. Good service is 80 points or above, and it's basically service that meets the customer's expectations. And then we have ordinary service in the 70s, which is, you know, hit and miss. You're meeting expectations, but you're not doing it in a fantastic way. It's kind of boring service if you want. And then we have bland, where you're barely meeting expectations. And then we have the unheroic category, which I'm happy to say there's very few brands, but there are some brands that are actually unheroic. And the problem with being unheroic is you're not even doing the bare minimum. So I just want to remind you that we have in the middle, BOG, bog, so most brands are in the bog. So the first lesson that we've learned is about the kind of service level that we all aspire to have, heroic service. It's very, very rare. We actually hardly see it. in the 300 plus brands in Kuwait and the same in the UAE, we have seen very few brands that are able to attain above a 90, but they do exist. So what we did here is we looked at the 10-year average score for each brand. So we took the 10-year scores and, how do they look like? What we found is you'll see 17% of brands are scoring in the 60s, which we said were bland, right? They're barely meeting expectations. The 70s is where most companies are at. They're offering unexciting service. The 22% that you see have scores in the mid-80s, and then only 4% of companies in Kuwait have consistently scored in the high 80s. It's very, very tough to do that. So heroic service is super rare. The other thing that we saw is the brands that I said, there was one brand in Kuwait that had a 90, and there was one in the UAE. It was very hard for them to maintain them across more than 2 or 3 years. It's a very difficult feat to do because of something that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. The other lesson we learned is looking at consistency and quality. So can a brand, what is the relationship between offering consistently the same service level have to do with satisfaction? So here we looked at the scientists in the room, and I'm not a scientist, but standard deviation. So we looked at how much of the brand's score was erratic. Did it go up and down, or was it maintained in the same level? So that symbol at the bottom is standard deviation, and the first column you'll see is -2, which means there was very little variance in the score of these brands, and you'll see their customer satisfaction score on the top is 80. In other words, brands that were pretty much, their score was stable, it didn't change over the years, were able to offer what we've considered good service. Remember I said the bog. And then as you go down, you'll see it's very eye-opening that the more variance there are, which we're moving to the right, the more inconsistency in the service levels, the lower the customer satisfaction score. So it tells us that we need to be doing something about offering consistently the same service so it doesn't change, it doesn't vary. So that was the lesson here, is the correlation between consistency and excellence. Then we tried to look at improvement. So because we have the 10 years of data, we looked at it in multiple ways. We could have just said, okay, year 1 to year 10, but instead we said, what's the average growth rate each year, and tried to report on that. So we used what's called CAGR, cumulative average growth rate, but all you need to know is what is the average growth rate for brands. So here we're looking at the annual growth rate. First of all, the bad news is 30% of brands actually were dropping very slowly, but they were dropping every single year. So that means they were dropping -1% every single year that the index was running. Then you have another group, 41% of brands that were improving, which is good news. They're improving up to around 1% per year. And as we move to the extreme right, you have 12%, you'll see that 12% of brands every single year improve 2% or above. So their satisfaction scores were not standing still, they were constantly evolving and improving. And the one thing that we've seen about those 12% is they behave a certain way, which I'll be ending the talk about. What do they look like? We try to look at also repeat business. So what is the correlation between the frequency of somebody engaging with a brand and their customer satisfaction scores? And what we see is that if you satisfy them, they'll come back. And if you don't satisfy them, they will not come back as frequently. And that means economically, loss of business. So it becomes very important to look at that. So here what we're asking is, how often do you deal with a brand? And then we're taking the satisfaction scores. So you'll see 80% of customers that go weekly to the brands have satisfaction scores of 80.1, which means that they have good, healthy scores, right? We said 80 was in the good range. And then very gradually, as we move to less frequently and even less frequently, you'll see that satisfaction actually drops down to 66 points out of 100 when people interact with the brand annually. Now, part of this is also to do with the industry, so I will talk a little bit about industries here. The weekly scores are more common with industries that people will interact with more frequently, like a cafe or fast food. And then the monthly scores will correlate more to a bank, where people actually interact with the bank maybe once a month, and clothes and casual dining. So the scores are also a reflection of the type of industry that a brand resides in. But again, the lesson, just you looking at the whole data set, you'll realize that if we are able to satisfy customer needs better, people will engage with us more. Now we're looking at how we handle complaints. So the way a brand handles a complaint, and complaints will always happen, right? But how a brand handles a complaint is a moment of truth. If a brand is able to, gracefully address the complaint, then we'll see that satisfaction is high. So what we see here is looking at the correlation between their score for handling a complaint, because we're actually asking a question, how well did the brand fix an issue that you had, and their customer satisfaction score, which is on the top. So what we find is, let's look at the extreme left. The extreme left says that if the complaint score was so much lower than satisfaction score, then the satisfaction score is going to be low. And on the extreme right, if the complaint score was better than the satisfaction score, then we'll have healthier satisfaction scores. So it tells us something about the way brands need to manage complaints immediately, in a positive way, being proactive, and also saying the magic word, we're sorry, this is really unfortunate, we'd like to address it. So all of these trends tell us that, there's some golden nuggets that companies need to just remember as they operate. What about expectations? So our index is asking two sets of questions. What's your expectation and what's your actual satisfaction? Service at the end of the day is serving somebody to meet their expectations, right? You go somewhere, you have an expectation, you want to meet that expectation. What is excellent service? It's exceeding those expectations or consistently meeting expectations in a positive way. So let's take a look at expectations in Kuwait. The green line is expectations. And as you can see, it's constantly growing generally. It'll dip once in a while. But the trend is very clear. It's an upward trend. And then you see in the blue line is the national Customer Satisfaction Index score, which is a weighted average. So each industry has a weight of 1. Each brand within an industry has a weight of 1 so that there's no bias anywhere. And you'll see that Kuwait, in general, has scored 75.1 points across the 10 years. Whereas right now, it is our highest negative gap between what customers expect and what they're getting. It's -9 points. So what's happening? Consumers are continuing to expect more, and brands are not always able to satisfy those expectations. So it becomes very important for companies to look at, and within the different industries it'll vary, but companies need to understand what are they expecting from us and how can we match that. Another trend that we saw is a gradual move of transactions from brick and mortar store branch to online. So in the beginning when we were running this, we saw a lot more of the transactions were happening in the branch. Now as we run it, we're beginning to see, although the branch is still important, it still is 70% of the pie. What we've seen is online transactions have grown 30% since last year. So people are gravitating towards the online arena, and the satisfaction score for online arena is higher than it is for any other one, so it's 76.9. The very interesting thing here is by industry, when we looked at it, some industries actually have 50% and more of their transaction mix happening online. These industries are telecoms, ISPs, banks, and airlines. All of them have a transaction mix that's favoring online. So again, what's the lesson here? That we need to be able to serve customers across all of these different channels, regardless of what channel they're using, but at the same level of relationship building and excellence across the channels. Not, we need to speak the same language basically across the channels. Some people call it omni-channel. Whatever you call it, it is the consistency of the service offering across the channels. I'm going to begin to wrap up now so looking at all these lessons, what have we seen? We are, again, I started saying that we're very privileged. I really feel that because we are in a situation where we can interact with brands that are airlines or banks or hospitals or restaurants, and they're very, very different. But these interactions are very eye-opening, where you can see that the brands that have been able to take the lessons that I've spoken about, be consistent, improve constantly, understand how to manage a complaint and bounce back gracefully after a complaint, manage the different channels that they have. The brands that are able to do that have one thing in common. And that one thing in common is that they have a culture of excellence. The culture of excellence basically is comprised of what we have termed the trinity of excellence. And the trinity is 3 components, and coffee lover. coffee bean, you get the coffee bean. Second one is you roast it, you break it up. And then third one is you drink the coffee. So this is the approach that we follow for the Trinity of Excellence. And the Trinity of Excellence basically says the first step, and Dr. Adnan actually mentioned this in his talk, is setting the vision. What is the vision the organization wants to take? It's shocking to us when we see how little that's happening. We see a lot of dysfunctional cultures. When we measure the index, we see that, where the messages get scrambled. One day it's profits, one day it's reduced costs, and then one day it's excellence, but shyly. So the point that we're trying to make is that if you really want to make a difference and move the pendulum, you need to be very clear with your goal in terms of the service level you want to achieve and how to get there. So the first job is to be very clear, lead and inspire, be a role model, support the troops or support the team, troops, to ensure that you get there. Then after you've done that, and only after you've done that, is winning the heart. Winning the heart is this building of passion. So people do the things that they do because they want to do them, not because they're paid to do them. It's a very, very different proposition. Being paid, you behave a certain way, but when you want to do it because you're part of it, you're engaged, you're incentivized, you're rewarded, you're trained, is a totally different formula. And then the third one is convincing the mind, which is the systems and the engines that allow companies to be consistent across the years. Because we run a culture of excellence index, so we have our own internal survey that we run on some companies. And we've seen that of the three, the area that's usually the area where companies focus their attention on is the last one, which is the procedures and the systems. Why? Regulation, franchise rules, central bank, CETA for mobile operators, whatever. There's so many different pressures on them to regulate and introduce standards. And yes, that's important, but if you only do that, you'll be in the 70 bucket, which we said was the ordinary bucket. If you want your brand to become heroic, it has to be about the heart and it has to be about leadership. So I'm going to wrap up with coming back to the topic of agility, because we want to stay relevant. As a service hero, we understand that for us to continue to operate for another 10 years, we need to understand what our stakeholders want. And we have two stakeholders. We have consumers on the one hand, and then we have companies on the other. And we really aim to collect as much feedback from consumers, because the more we are able to do that, the more companies will listen. So for us, the agility was the launch of our app 2 weeks ago. And the reason we did it and invested a lot of time and effort into it was consumers were telling us, why don't you have an app? We want to easily look up a brand. We want to easily see the ratings and the reviews and everything like that. So it's a way to engage more with our consumers. So that was the first reason we did that. And in the 2 weeks that we've launched it, we've seen very, very good traction where consumers are actually spending more time and doing more ratings on the app than if they log in every once in a while. So the second thing that we've done is we've tweaked our questions a little bit. We simplified and we made contextual questions. So now we're asking several questions about, these are 3 panels, 3 sets of questions. But if somebody answered, if they dealt with a branch online, then it's a slightly different set of questions. We added social media and we added questions specifically on apps, because apps are very, very important to customers. And then the final thing that I'd like to say is, as I said, we've become very, very familiar with culture, with the idea of building cultures of excellence, building cultures that encourage heroic behavior. And because of that, we continue to do research for companies, and we do training, and we do a bunch of other services, all to help companies improve. We have some handouts on the tables in front of you that gives you an idea of our service range, but it includes as well training on the ABCs of excellence, which surprisingly very few companies do on a regular basis to maintain their scores. I'm going to end tonight's presentation with a plagiarized quote. I admit, shoot me, K-Fast, because I know you're very big on plagiarism. But Aristotle said 2,000 years ago that excellence is not an act, but a habit. Okay, so my plagiarism on that is excellence is not an act or an accident. It's a habit and a culture. And ladies and gentlemen, that has become our purpose and our mission, to help companies build cultures of excellence. Thank you very much.